The music was soft, the champagne cold, and my mother was radiant under the chandeliers as guests toasted her. I had just slipped my phone from my clutch when the alert came through. $15,000. My visa. My mother's party. I walked toward her, each step feeling heavier than the heels on my feet. When I asked, she smiled like nothing mattered but appearances, and whispered, "Don't ruin the vibe." In that moment, something inside me shifted. Years of swallowing her decisions, of being the reliable one, of paying the invisible bills. It all condensed into one sharp truth: I wasn't going to let her write the ending this time. My name is Madeline, and this is how I took it back. The late summer sun was already beginning to dip when I stepped out of the cab in front of the Belmont Grand Hotel in downtown Portland. The valet in a crisp navy suit opened the door with a polite nod, and I smoothed the skirt of my dark green dress before stepping onto the red carpet that led to the main entrance. Inside, the marble floors gleamed under the golden glow of chandeliers, and a string of jazz notes floated through the air from somewhere deeper in the ballroom. It smelled faintly of lilies and expensive champagne, the kind of scent that told you no detail had been left to chance. Tonight was my mother's 61st birthday, and apparently she had decided to mark it like she was hosting a gala for royalty. 80 guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns milled around the vast ballroom, glasses in hand, laughing a little too loudly the way people do when they want to be noticed. The waitstaff moved in precise choreography, trays of hors d'oeuvres, balanced on fingertips, weaving between clusters of people without so much as a stumble. I spotted my Aunt Grace near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. She wore her usual soft lavender blouse and a string of pearls that caught the light as she turned to greet me. We hugged, her perfume familiar and calming against the undercurrent of tension that always accompanied events like this. She began telling me about a neighbor's new puppy, and for a moment it felt almost normal. Then my phone buzzed in my clutch. I glanced down, half expecting it to be a message from Olivia, saying she was running late. Instead, it was a push notification from my bank app. My pulse kicked up before I even opened it. The words swam into focus. Visa transaction approved. Amount $15,000. Merchant Mitchell Signature Events. Portland, OR. I froze, the din of the party dulling to a low hum in my ears. My mind immediately went to David Mitchell, my mother's oldest friend, and conveniently the owner of one of the most expensive event companies in the city. I looked around, taking in the custom floral arrangements, the live band, the elaborate dessert table in the corner. This wasn't just an indulgent birthday party. This was a production. Sliding the phone back into my clutch, I excused myself from Grace and crossed the ballroom. My mother was near the center in a floor-length champagne-colored gown, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon. She held court among a group of guests, her laughter ringing like a bell. For a moment, I just watched her, the way she tilted her head and touched someone's arm when she spoke, every gesture calculated. When she turned toward me, I stepped into her circle, waited just long enough for her to finish whatever charming anecdote she was spinning, and said in a voice only she could hear that we needed to talk. She smiled like I'd just complimented her dress, excused herself from the group, and walked with me toward the edge of the room near the bar where the music wasn't quite as loud. I told her I had just received an alert for a $15,000 charge on my visa payable to David's company, and asked if she knew anything about it. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned in, her perfume floral and sweet, and said softly, almost conspiratorially, "Don't ruin the vibe." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her, but she was already straightening that fixed social smile back in place as she glanced over her shoulder at the guests. My jaw tightened. Heat rose in my chest, the kind that made me want to throw every truth I'd been swallowing for years right into the center of her perfect party. But I didn't. Not here. Not now. I stepped back, giving her room to glide away and rejoin her admirers. My fingers clenched around the clutch until the beads pressed into my skin. Somewhere across the room, Olivia had her camera up, snapping candid shots of guests. Her brow furrowed in that way that told me she'd noticed something was off. Our eyes met briefly, and she tilted her head slightly as if to ask if I was okay. I forced a small nod. The band launched into a lively swing number, couples moving toward the dance floor. Glasses clinked, laughter swelled, and my mother's voice floated above it all, as controlled and polished as ever. I stood on the edge of the crowd watching, listening, and feeling the edges of a decision begin to take shape in my mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I slipped farther from the dance floor and let the music become a soft blur behind the thrum in my ears. The glow of cut crystal and the bright spray of white lilies seemed too sharp, like a photograph overexposed by a flash. I set my clutch on the edge of a cocktail table and opened the bank app again, as if the number might blink and change into something reasonable. 15,000. Mitchell Signature Events, Portland. My mother's laugh carried across the room, light and effortless, as if the world had never asked her for anything she did not want to give. The old sentence rose in my head, the one she had polished over the years, until it gleamed like a rule carved in stone. Family is for helping each other. It sounded generous when she said it at church potlucks and neighborhood fundraisers. In our house, it meant Madeline will handle it. You have a steady job. You do the responsible thing. You make the call. You put it on your card. You figure it out. In 2014, I was 25 and living in a studio apartment off Rainier Avenue in Seattle, eating a lot of rice and eggs, and saying no to every after-work drink because my student loans did not care about happy hour specials. Aunt Linda had slipped on black ice outside a grocery store in Bend and broke her wrist in 2 places. I learned this from my mother in a voicemail that landed while I was on the light rail home. She said the hospital wanted a deposit today, and that Linda's coverage had a deductible they could not meet. She said this was not the time to be stubborn. I called back from my front steps while fumbling with my keys. I said I had rent due. She said she had already given my number to the billing office because they needed a card right now, and the rest we could settle later. I stood in my narrow kitchen, with its flickering fluorescent light, and recited the numbers on my visa to a stranger who thanked me in a soft, administrative voice. I told myself it was a one-time family emergency. I made peanut butter toast for dinner and moved my loan payment to the next week. Later that month, my mother suggested we take Aunt Linda out for brunch to celebrate her healing. She chose the restaurant. I picked up the check. By 2016, my brother Lucas had a promotion at St. Mary's as a surgical fellow, a path my mother could talk about for hours at any gathering that involved a cheese board. He showed up at my place one Sunday with a cardboard pizza box and the look of a man who had rehearsed an apology on the drive over. He said he had a temporary cash flow issue and a card that had gotten away from him. He said he could cover most of it soon, but the bank had hit him with a penalty, and the interest would balloon. My mother called while he was there. She used that tone that sounds like a hug to people who do not know her. She said Lucas had been under a lot of pressure, and it would be foolish to let his credit score take a hit when I could avert a crisis with a simple payment. She said she would help me work out a repayment plan. I paid $4,200 toward his balance that afternoon. Lucas promised he would get it back to me by summer. Summer became fall. At Christmas, my mother handed him a gold envelope with tickets to a Blazers game, while telling me in the kitchen that timing had been difficult and to be patient. In January, I got a new credit card offer in the mail. The rate was lower for 12 months. I transferred the balance and reminded myself I was being strategic. 2 winters later, a Pineapple Express storm ripped across the coast, and Portland's news kept showing toppled trees and flooded basements. My mother called after midnight, sounding brave and small. There was water coming through a seam near the chimney. She said the roof had been patched years ago by a neighbor who was trying to be helpful, and that now a real contractor was needed. She said her home equity line was maxed because of a remodel she had put into the shop to attract better clients, and that she could not let the house, the one we grew up in, take on more damage. I told her to forward the estimate. It was a number that made my stomach clench. $9,200 and change. The contractor wanted a deposit the next day. She asked if she could put it on my card because she did not want to lose the crew. I told myself I was protecting value and history, and that the repayment would come when she sold a set of Italian leather chairs she had on consignment. In the spring, those chairs appeared in a photo on her store's Instagram, not with a sold tag, but in a window display beside a hand-knotted rug. I scrolled past the likes and comments while eating a salad at my desk, and felt the quiet click of something inside me, a small bolt sliding into a locked position. The pattern was so clean by 2020 that she barely needed to explain. Lucas and Mariah had been planning a wedding in Hood River that got postponed, and my mother decided they needed a reset. She said a week in Maui was the exact medicine for stress, and that airline prices were strong but fair given the season. She said she could not get her card to go through for the deposit on a bundled package because her bank had flagged it and the hold would take days. She said she knew I had points and that she would reimburse me before the statement closed. I spent an evening on the phone with a travel agent while stirring a pot of soup and switching between tabs for flights and hotel options. I sent the itinerary to a group thread my mother created and got a stream of palm tree emojis from Mariah and a single thumbs up from Lucas. When the bill came, the amount did not fit neatly anywhere in my budget. I emailed my mother a breakdown of costs and timelines. She replied with a note about liquidity and how small businesses live week to week. She thanked me for being the steady one. I paid the minimum and watched the interest tick forward in tiny, precise steps. Sitting in the Belmont Grand with the band swinging and the dessert table sparkling like a jewelry case, I could feel each of those years in my shoulders, the weight arranged across a spine that had learned to carry what other people set down. Aunt Grace drifted toward me with 2 flutes of champagne and offered one. She did not ask what was wrong. She just stood beside me, a quiet island in a bright sea of laughter. Olivia snapped a photo of a couple at the far end of the room, then glanced over again, reading the air, the way only a friend does. I tilted my head toward the terrace and walked out into the cooler night. The city hummed below a long band of lights along the river. I put my palms on the stone railing and breathed until the edges in my chest softened. I thought about the nights I had opened spreadsheets to figure out which bills could slide 3 days without a fee. I thought about the projects I had turned down at work because I was picking up side gigs to get ahead of interest. I thought about the way my mother lit up when she talked about Lucas's residency and how she lowered her voice when she asked me for a favor. Responsible sounded noble until it meant invisible. I remembered a Sunday in 2017 at my mother's kitchen table. She had brewed coffee in the French press and set out a plate of lemon bars from a bakery near her shop. She said family is for helping each other and laid her hand over mine like she was blessing me. I said I needed her to set boundaries with Lucas. She said he was saving lives and that the world demanded sacrifices from people like him and that people like me, organized and capable, could make those sacrifices easier. I told her I was saving my own life in ways she did not see. She smiled sadly and said I was being dramatic. I went home and cleaned my bathroom to quiet the loudness inside my head. Back on the terrace, I pulled out my phone and took screenshots of the bank alert from 3 angles. I emailed the images to my account with a subject line that would be easy to search later. Harper Evidence. I saved a note with the timestamp and the merchant name. I opened the contact card for David Mitchell and stared at the number without calling. There would be a time for that. Not tonight. I folded the mental list I was making and slid it into a place where I keep plans I am not ready to say out loud. When I stepped inside again, the band had shifted to a slow ballad, the sort of song people sway to with their eyes closed. My mother had moved to the dais and was accepting compliments from a couple I recognized from the Historical Society. She looked luminous, every angle considered, every word measured. I felt the old tug to let it go for now, and then let it go forever. The tug was familiar, like a coat someone keeps putting over your shoulders when you say you are warm enough. Olivia met me halfway across the room and touched my elbow. She asked softly if I needed anything. I told her I was fine and that the light was gorgeous near the cake table if she wanted some shots. She looked at me a second too long and nodded, then lifted her camera. Aunt Grace slipped her arm through mine and said that the lilies smelled like spring, even though fall was coming, and that the view from the windows made Portland look like a city from a postcard. I rested my head briefly against her shoulder before we turned back toward the crowd. This was not a moment for scenes or speeches. It was a moment for the quiet work that comes before the visible part. I thought about the hospital deposit and the credit card and the roof and the trip and the 1,000 times I had swallowed an argument because I was tired and it was easier to pay than to fight. The number on my phone was not just a charge, it was a summary. And summaries can be amended. The band finished the song, and a murmur of applause rose and fell. A server glided past with tiny glasses of lemon sorbet, and I took one just to have something cold in my hand. My mother caught my eye across the room and lifted her glass in a small toast that could have meant anything. I returned the gesture without a smile. I am not the firework kind of person. I am the fuse. I carry the spark quiet and steady until it reaches what needs to change. I set the empty glass on a passing tray and straightened my shoulders. This time would not disappear into a family story told over coffee about how Madeline always steps up. This time had a number and a date and a merchant code. This time had witnesses and files and a plan taking shape that felt like an answer I had owed myself for a very long time. The morning after this party, Seattle's rain tapped a restless rhythm against my apartment windows as I opened my laptop and logged into my online banking. The numbers stared back at me, that same $15,000 charge sitting like a bruise on my account. I pulled the statement highlighting the transaction details and downloading the PDF. The merchant was listed as Mitchell Events, LLC. I knew that name. David Mitchell. My mother's longtime friend, her favorite creative genius for every gala and fundraiser she'd ever hosted. I searched my email history for his name, filtering through years of old invitations and receipts. Nothing recent. That meant the booking wasn't mine, and sure as hell wasn't authorized. Digging deeper, I opened the transaction's merchant info page. There it was, in black and white: venue rental at the Alabaster Room Jazz Quartet, fee luxury floral arrangements, and one suspicious line item: gift procurement, $10,000. My stomach tightened. Before I could process the absurdity of it, my phone buzzed. Olivia's name lit the screen. I answered on the second ring. "You're not going to believe this," she said without preamble. "I was reviewing clips from the party for the magazine, and I caught something you need to see." 20 minutes later, she was at my place, shaking the rain from her coat. She opened her laptop and played the video. The camera panned past a group of guests, landing on David Mitchell, leaning toward my mother. His voice was low, but the mic on the camera had picked up every word. "Madeline will never know," he said, his smirk almost casual. My mother's answering laugh was soft, almost indulgent, as if they were sharing an inside joke. I felt the blood drain from my face. There it was, confirmation I wasn't imagining things. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was intentional. "Send me that file," I told Olivia, my voice steadier than I felt. She did, and I copied it into a new folder on my desktop. I named it Harper. Evidence. One by one, I dropped in the bank statement, the transaction PDF, and screenshots from David's company website listing the exact event packages purchased. When the folder closed on my screen, it felt like sealing a box. But this wasn't for storage. This was for use. I sat back, staring at the rain streaking down the glass. The anger was still there, sharp and hot, but now it had direction. I wasn't going to confront my mother in a shouting match she could spin as emotional. I was going to build something she couldn't laugh away over champagne. And for the first time in years, I felt the scales tip just slightly toward my side. 2 days later, I was sitting in a leather chair in a corner office that overlooked the gray sprawl of downtown Seattle. The rain had cleared for once, sunlight catching on the glass towers across the street. But the light didn't warm me. My hands rested on a manila folder stuffed with printouts, receipts, and the USB drive Olivia had handed me. Across the desk, Thomas Reed flipped through the documents with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who had seen every variety of betrayal. Thomas was in his early 50s, tall with a calm that felt like bedrock. He wore a dark suit and a burgundy tie, the knot pulled tight, his reading glasses low on his nose. Every now and then, he would pause, reread a line, then make a note on a yellow legal pad. I watched his pen move and tried not to let my impatience show. When he set the papers down, he leaned back slightly. His eyes met mine, steady and assessing. He asked me to walk him through it in my own words. So I did. I told him about the bank alert, the $15,000 charge, the video of David Mitchell speaking to my mother. I laid out the timeline, the years of being the family safety net, the times I'd been told to be patient, that repayment was coming, that I was overreacting. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "This is clean," he said. "You have documentation, a recorded admission, and clear proof the card was used without authorization. In Washington, that is a solid claim for reimbursement, plus you're entitled to interest and possibly legal fees." I asked what it would look like to pursue it. His answer was calm, methodical. "We could start with a formal demand letter, give her the option to repay without court involvement. If she refused, we could file a civil suit for the principal, plus accrued interest." He estimated an additional $2,000 in interest and costs if we moved quickly. Before I could respond, the door opened and a woman stepped in carrying a laptop and a coffee. Sophie Grant Thomas said, introducing her as his associate. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She scanned the file in front of her and then looked at me. "If you want to make this stick," she said, "you should consider serving her in a public setting. Not to humiliate her for the sake of it, but because having witnesses can be very persuasive when someone likes to rewrite history." I felt a slow pull in my chest at the idea. My mother lived for appearances. The thought of her receiving legal papers in front of her friends and admirers was almost too satisfying to picture. Sophie leaned forward, explaining that service at a public event ensured she couldn't later claim she hadn't been informed. It also created a moment others could corroborate. Thomas added that if I wanted this to be over quickly, a strategic serve could push her toward a settlement. Lawsuits, he said, were like storms. Some people wait them out. Others look for shelter fast. I hesitated, running my fingers along the seam of the folder. Part of me wanted the clean private resolution. Another part, the part that had been carrying the weight for years, knew that quiet solutions often led to quiet repeats. Sophie asked if my mother had any upcoming events. I told her she was planning a thank you dinner for the people who had helped with her birthday celebration. It was scheduled at a high-end Italian place in Portland next month. Thomas exchanged a look with Sophie that I recognized as professional agreement. "That's your moment," he said. We talked logistics. They had a process server named Carter Hayes, who was discreet but effective. We would prepare the documents, time the service for mid-event, and have Olivia present to record from a distance. I was careful to keep my face neutral as they laid it out, but inside something cold and sharp was taking shape. Thomas closed the folder and rested his hands on it. "One question," he said. "Are you prepared to confront your mother in front of a room full of her friends? It won't be a shouting match, but it will be a confrontation." The air in the room felt still. I thought about the way she had leaned toward me at the party, smiling as she told me not to ruin the vibe, as if my role was to keep her illusions intact. I thought about every time I'd chosen silence to keep the peace. I met his gaze and nodded once. Sophie smiled slightly, already making notes on her laptop. Thomas pushed back his chair and stood offering his hand. "Then we'll move forward," he said. When I left the office, the streets were wet and shining, the air smelling faintly of salt from the sound. My reflection in the glass of the building next door looked composed, but under the surface the ground was shifting. The first pieces of something irreversible had just been set in motion. Monday morning at Northwest Digital Solutions started like any other, with the hum of conversations over coffee and the faint clicking of keyboards echoing through the open-plan office. I had barely dropped my bag by my desk when a message popped up from Rebecca Clark's assistant asking me to come to her office. Rebecca didn't do unscheduled meetings unless something was wrong. Her office was glass-walled with a view of Elliott Bay, a space that always smelled faintly of eucalyptus from the diffuser on her credenza. She stood when I entered, gesturing to the chair opposite her desk. I sat resting my hands in my lap, watching her fold hers carefully on top of a stack of client briefs. I was expecting feedback on the campaign for the Mariner Tech account, or a conversation about timelines. Instead, she asked if I had any idea why people in our professional circle might be discussing my family. The question landed with the weight of a cold stone. She went on to say that over the weekend, she had attended a networking brunch and overheard a pair of agency directors whispering about a scene at a birthday party in Portland. According to them, I had confronted my mother in the middle of the event and caused a disruption that left guests uncomfortable. In their version, I was dramatic, disrespectful, and unprofessional. I told Rebecca that I hadn't confronted anyone. She held up a hand, stopping me. She said she wasn't here to judge the truth of what happened, but to point out that perception was already circulating, and perception in our line of work was currency. She leaned back in her chair, her expression measured. The Mariner Tech launch was coming up, a project I had been leading for months. It was high profile, with a client known for being meticulous about brand image. Rebecca said she couldn't risk any unwanted attention bleeding into the account. For now, she was assigning the client-facing portion to another manager until things settled. The words hit harder than I expected. I asked if there had been any complaints from Mariner Tech directly. She said no, but she wanted to keep it that way. This wasn't a demotion, she insisted, just a temporary shift. I nodded, but my throat felt tight. When I left her office, the chatter in the bullpen seemed louder, sharper. A few heads turned as I passed, glances flicking away the moment I met them. Back at my desk, the project files for Mariner Tech were still open on my monitor. I closed them slowly, one by one, and transferred the active work to a shared folder. It wasn't just about the project. This was my reputation. In marketing, relationships traveled faster than resumes. If a narrative about me as unprofessional gained traction, it could follow me for years. I thought about my mother's world, the way she thrived on telling stories about people she knew, embellishing details to suit the moment. It wasn't hard to imagine her version of events reaching the wrong ears. All it would take was a remark over wine about how her daughter had made a scene, how she'd embarrassed herself. The rest would fill in itself. At lunch, I met Olivia at a cafe 2 blocks from the office. I told her what had happened, how Rebecca had framed it, and Olivia's jaw tightened. She said she'd overheard similar chatter at a gallery opening the night before. Someone had mentioned that family drama had overshadowed the party and hinted it was about money. I stirred my soup without tasting it, the knot in my stomach tightening. This wasn't just a smear. It was strategic, intentional, and designed to isolate me. Financial damage was one thing, but this was aimed at the foundation I had built for myself. Back at the office, I spent the rest of the afternoon working on lower-profile accounts, but my mind was elsewhere. Every email I sent felt like a test, every conversation in the hallway a possible judgment. As the day wound down, I sat at my desk and opened the Harper evidence folder on my laptop. I scrolled through the files, the bank statement, the PDF breakdown, the screenshots, the video of David Mitchell's smirk. My reflection in the screen looked steady, but my pulse was quick. This was no longer about recovering a charge. It was about cutting off her reach before she could do more damage. I closed the laptop and slipped it into my bag. Outside, the sky was bruised with the colors of early evening, and the wind off the bay was sharp. I tightened my coat and started the walk to my car, the sound of my heels on the wet pavement matching the rhythm of the thought repeating in my head. She had taken my money. Now she was coming for my name. Grace's house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books, a mix that always made me feel like I'd stepped out of the noise and into a quieter time. She had invited me over for tea, saying there was something we needed to talk about. Her voice carrying that undercurrent of urgency she only used when it mattered. I followed her into the kitchen, where steam curled up from a porcelain teapot and 2 cups sat waiting on the table. She poured without a word, the amber liquid catching the light from the window. Then she sat across from me and folded her hands. The lines on her fingers deepened by time and work. She asked if I remembered the old summer nights when we would sit on the porch with my grandfather, talking about the house he built and how it was meant to stay in the family. I nodded, unsure where this was going, but sensing a weight behind her words. Grace took a slow sip of tea before telling me that in 2020, my mother had changed her will. The house on Alder Street, the one worth $850,000, even in the market back then, had been taken out of my share entirely and left in full to Lucas. She paused, watching my reaction, as if bracing for me to argue. The words hit like a door slamming in my chest. That house wasn't just property. It was every holiday dinner, every framed photo in the hallway, every whispered conversation on the back porch when the adults thought we couldn't hear. It was supposed to be split between us, a shared legacy. Now it was gone, and I had never even known it was on the table to lose. I asked her how she knew, and she admitted she had been there when my mother signed the updated papers. Evelyn had asked her to be a witness along with a man from the law office. Grace said she remembered thinking it was strange I wasn't mentioned, but Evelyn brushed it off, saying I was doing fine and didn't need the house. The chair creaked as I leaned back, trying to absorb the sharp edges of what she'd just told me. This wasn't just about a sudden decision. It fit too neatly with everything else: the money taken, the whispers about my character, the steady removal of my footing piece by piece. It was a plan careful and deliberate to cut me out of both the present and the future. I asked Grace why she was telling me now. She said she'd kept quiet because she didn't want to fuel family tension, but after hearing how the birthday party had unfolded and the things she'd overheard Evelyn say afterward, she couldn't stay silent. Her voice dropped when she told me she still had a copy of the old will. She had kept it in her filing cabinet, tucked between utility bills and insurance forms, just in case. She wasn't sure why she hadn't thrown it away, but she was glad she hadn't. I stared at her, the gratitude mixing with a slow-burning anger. That document wasn't just paper. It was proof of intent, a timeline that could show when my mother started moving the pieces against me. Grace reached across the table and rested her hand over mine, her skin cool and steady. She said she was willing to testify if it came to that. She had seen the changes she had signed the page, and she wasn't afraid to tell the truth under oath. I asked her if she realized what that could mean for her relationship with my mother. She nodded, her eyes clear. Family is supposed to look out for each other, she said, and sometimes that means protecting one member from another. I left her house with a manila envelope tucked inside my bag, the edges of the old will pressing against the fabric like it wanted to be remembered. Outside, the air was damp with the promise of rain, and the streetlights were just starting to hum to life. Driving back toward the city, the skyline rising against a slate-gray sky, I could feel the shape of the fight ahead. This wasn't just about getting back what had been taken. It was about dismantling a plan my mother had been building for years, brick by brick, all while smiling at me across holiday tables. When I pulled into my garage, I sat for a moment with the engine off, the quiet filling the space. In my mind, I could hear her laugh from the party, could see the way she brushed off my question with that line about not ruining the vibe. Now I knew exactly what she had been protecting. It wasn't the party. It was the scaffolding of a story where I didn't exist. Upstairs, I slid the envelope into the Harper evidence folder in my filing cabinet next to the printed bank statements and the flash drive from Olivia. The drawer closed with a decisive click. Grace's willingness to stand beside me added a new layer of certainty. This wasn't going to be a conversation anymore. It was going to be a reckoning, and for the first time, I could see the path to it. Thomas's conference room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and leather, the blinds half closed against a gray Seattle morning. The manila envelope from Grace sat in the center of the table, like it was its own witness, the weight of its contents obvious even before Thomas slid it open. He took his time reviewing the old will, his pen scratching quick notes onto a legal pad. Sophie sat beside him with her laptop open, eyes flicking between the scanned documents and a calendar window. We had already decided this was not going to court in the abstract. This was going to start with something sharp, something public. Sophie pulled up an event listing on her screen. Evelyn's thank you dinner for the birthday supporters was set for 2 Saturdays from now, at Bella Notte, a high-end Italian restaurant in downtown Portland. The guest list included her closest friends, a few city council members she liked to name-drop, and several clients from her store. The perfect stage, Sophie said. Thomas leaned back, steepling his fingers. We serve her midway through the evening once everyone is seated and comfortable. Carter Hayes will handle the delivery. He's professional, calm, and knows how to make an entrance without creating a scene that could hurt us later. Olivia will be there as a guest of Grace with her equipment hidden in plain sight. She'll capture the moment from start to finish. I asked about timing. Sophie suggested waiting until after the first course, when the room is settled and the servers have stepped back. Enough time for the audience to be paying attention without being distracted by arrivals. Thomas tapped his pen against the table. We need to package the service with precision. The envelope Carter delivers will contain the formal demand for repayment of the $15,000 plus interest, a notice of intent to litigate regarding the inheritance issue, and an itemized list of evidence. It's not just paperwork, he said. It's the first move in a match she doesn't know she's playing. I thought about Evelyn at that long table, the glow of the candles catching in her earrings, the tilt of her head when she's enjoying the sound of her own narrative. I pictured the shift in her expression when Carter interrupted it. Sophie pulled a printed seating chart from her folder. Grace had managed to get a copy from one of Evelyn's assistants under the pretense of helping with arrangements. She pointed to where Evelyn would be sitting centered along the far wall, in full view of most of the room. Carter could enter from the main doors, cross diagonally, and approach her without obstruction. Thomas looked at me directly. "This isn't just about the money, Madeline. This is about the line you draw and never step back from. Once you cross it, there's no unknowing, no pretending you didn't take your stand." The words settled over me like the click of a lock. I nodded, feeling the weight of what we were about to set in motion. We spent the next hour refining the plan. Carter would be briefed in person the day before, given a folder with exact phrasing for when he handed over the documents. Sophie would prepare a backup set in case anything went wrong. Olivia would bring 2 cameras, one disguised as a phone she could hold casually, the other set up on a small tripod near Grace's table. Before I left, Thomas handed me a clean copy of the timeline we had built, every incident, every piece of proof now aligned in order. At the bottom, he had written in neat block letters, "This is the story you are telling." Walking out of the office, I could feel the difference in my steps. It wasn't hesitation anymore. It was readiness. The air outside was cool and damp, the kind of day Seattle seemed to make on repeat, but I barely noticed. In less than 2 weeks, Evelyn's carefully curated world would meet the first crack. And this time I would be the one holding the hammer. The chandeliers in Bella Notte cast a golden light over the white linen tables, making every wine glass sparkle like crystal. The scent of fresh basil and garlic drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the low hum of conversation. I sat near the back beside Grace, my seat angled just enough to see the head table where Evelyn presided. She wore a deep emerald dress that caught the light every time she turned, and her smile was the kind she used for photographs, wide, practiced, unyielding. Plates had been cleared from the first course, and servers moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses. Evelyn rose, a champagne flute in hand, and tapped it gently with a silver fork. The room hushed. Her voice, warm and smooth, filled the air as she thanked her wonderful friends for making her birthday such a success. She spoke about community, about loyalty, about gratitude. The irony was almost too much to swallow. Halfway through her remarks, the main doors at the far end of the dining room opened. Carter Hayes stepped inside in a dark suit, his posture straight, his expression neutral. He crossed the room with measured steps, weaving between tables with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times. Conversations faltered. A few guests turned to watch him approach the head table. I could see Olivia out of the corner of my eye, her phone angled just so the tiny red recording light hidden by her hand. Carter stopped in front of Evelyn, waited for her to finish a sentence, then held out a cream-colored envelope. His voice was calm and clear. "Mrs. Harper, you've been served." For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Evelyn's smile froze, the edges straining as if held together by will alone. She took the envelope slowly, her fingers tightening around it. A faint flush crept up her neck, visible even in the soft lighting. She glanced at the guests, then back at Carter. "Thank you," she said. Her tone dipped in sugar, but brittle underneath. She set the envelope on the table beside her glass and lifted her champagne again, as if nothing had happened. But the energy in the room had shifted. A couple at the far end whispered to each other, their eyes fixed on Evelyn. One man pushed his chair back and quietly excused himself, his date following with an apologetic smile to no one in particular. Across the table from Evelyn, a woman leaned toward her companion, lips moving in a quick stream of questions. Grace kept her gaze forward, her hands folded in her lap. I felt the tightness in my own chest ease just a little. This was not the eruption my mother thrived on the public scene she could twist into a story of her own. This was quieter, sharper, and infinitely harder to rewrite. Evelyn resumed speaking, thanking the guests again, but her voice carried an edge now, a strain beneath the polish. She avoided looking directly at me, though I knew she was aware of exactly where I sat. Her hand lingered on the envelope when she reached for her glass, almost as if she was keeping it from sliding away. Olivia lowered her phone, pretending to check a message, and gave the faintest nod in my direction. The moment was secured, documented from start to finish. When the servers began bringing out the next course, the room had not quite returned to its earlier warmth. The conversations were quieter, the laughter less frequent. A few guests kept glancing toward the head table, as if expecting something else to happen. Evelyn held her posture like a statue, smiling when spoken to, but letting her eyes drift to the envelope again and again. From my seat, I watched her lift her fork, cut into her food, and chew with the mechanical precision of someone going through the motions. She was already calculating, deciding her next move. I knew her well enough to recognize the tension in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, when she thought no one was watching. The rest of the dinner moved forward in that muted way, the undercurrent of curiosity and unease never quite fading. By the time dessert arrived, several more guests had made early exits, offering quick goodbyes that didn't match the length of the evening planned. When coffee was served, Grace touched my arm lightly, the unspoken signal that it was time to go. We stood, offered polite farewells to the guests nearest us, and made our way toward the door. I could feel Evelyn's gaze following, heavy and unblinking, but I didn't turn. Outside, the cool Portland night wrapped around us, the air damp and scented faintly of rain. Carter was waiting near the corner, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He gave a small nod before disappearing into the crowd moving along the sidewalk. Olivia joined us moments later, tucking her phone into her bag. "Got it all?" she said quietly, her breath clouding in the night air. We didn't linger. Grace's car was parked a block away, and as we walked toward it, the sounds of the city began to replace the muffled quiet of the restaurant. The envelope was in Evelyn's hands now, the clock already ticking. Whatever happened next, the opening move was over. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. Olivia had kept her promise to keep my name out of it, but the clip was too striking not to spread. It started on a private Facebook group for Portland social events. Then someone posted it on Instagram with the caption, "When dinner gets interesting," and within hours it was on a local gossip blog. The footage was clear enough to show Evelyn standing at the head table in her emerald dress, Carter handing her the envelope, and that half second where her smile cracked. The audio caught his voice delivering the line, "Mrs. Harper, you've been served," and the low ripple of whispers that followed. By midday, customers were leaving comments on the boutique's Instagram page. Some were supportive, but more were asking about the allegations mentioned in the court papers, speculation already filling in the blanks. A post about a spring fashion preview turned into a thread of people debating ethics, family loyalty, and misuse of funds. Grace called to tell me she'd driven past the store that afternoon and noticed it was unusually empty. Later, Olivia sent a screenshot of a Yelp review from someone who claimed they'd been a loyal customer for years, but wouldn't shop there again until Evelyn made things right. By the second day, it had spread beyond social media. A lifestyle segment on a local news station ran a piece on public legal drama in high society, showing blurred footage of the event and noting that neither party had commented. The anchor's tone was amused, but the effect was clear. People were talking. It wasn't just Evelyn who felt it. Olivia texted me a link to a press release from a regional decor company announcing that they had ended their partnership with David Mitchell's event firm, citing recent controversies. It was one of his biggest accounts. Through all of this, my phone stayed on silent. Reporters left messages asking for a statement. A blogger wanted an interview to set the record straight. And even a podcast host reached out, offering to let me tell my truth. I ignored them all. Thomas had been clear. Silence was leverage. Let her be the one scrambling to respond. On the third evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize but answered anyway. Lucas's voice came through quieter than I'd ever heard it. He asked if I was at home and if we could talk. I told him I was listening. There was a pause. Then he said he had seen the video. He admitted it had been making the rounds among his friends and colleagues, and that for the first time he understood why I was so angry. He didn't try to defend her. Instead, he said he felt ashamed for accepting the gifts from the birthday party, knowing now where the money had come from. I leaned against the counter, the cool marble under my palm, and waited for him to go on. He said Mom had been furious since the dinner, pacing the house and making calls to anyone who would pick up, trying to control the story. He told me she'd accused Grace of betrayal and warned him not to talk to me, but he couldn't pretend anymore. When he asked what would happen next, I told him it depended on her. The documents gave her a chance to resolve it before court. If she refused, I was prepared to move forward. There was no anger in my voice, just a clarity I hadn't had before. Lucas didn't argue. He just said he wished things hadn't gotten this far, and that he hoped she would listen for once. His voice caught slightly before he hung up. After the call, I sat in the quiet, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. Outside, the city lights reflected off the water, and I thought about the ripple effect that had already begun. Evelyn's reach had always felt endless, but now it was meeting resistance in places she couldn't charm her way through. I closed my laptop without checking the latest updates and walked to the window. Somewhere in the city, she was plotting her response, but for the first time in years, she wasn't the only one shaping the story. The air in Thomas's office was heavier than usual, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Evelyn arrived in a tailored navy suit, her hair perfectly set, flanked by a lawyer I didn't recognize. He was younger than Thomas by at least a decade, but his briefcase looked expensive, and he carried it like it held the outcome in his favor. We all took our seats around the polished conference table. Thomas sat to my right, Sophie just behind us with her laptop open. Across from me, Evelyn kept her eyes on Thomas, not on me, as if acknowledging my presence might give me too much ground before we even began. Her attorney opened with pleasantries, then quickly got to what he called a reasonable solution. They were willing to repay $5,000, which he said represented a fair portion of the disputed charge given the context, and to maintain family dignity. Evelyn nodded slightly, as if that was a generous offer. Thomas leaned forward, his voice calm but edged with steel. "That won't work. The demand is for repayment of the full $15,000 plus $2,000 in interest and legal fees." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the bank statement, the itemized invoice from Mitchell Events, and still frames from the video Olivia had taken. Evelyn's lawyer glanced at them, but kept speaking. "My client feels strongly about avoiding unnecessary public escalation. She is prepared to resolve this quietly and amicably, but only if we meet somewhere in the middle." I didn't wait for Thomas to answer. My voice was steady. "There is no middle. You took the money without my consent. You used it for an event and gifts I had no part in. Then you lied about it. The amount is not negotiable." Evelyn's gaze finally met mine. Her smile was thin, her tone almost sweet. "I am trying to protect the family name. Dragging this through the mud will only hurt you too." Thomas tapped the folder with his index finger. "This isn't about mud. It's about documented transactions, recorded conversations, and a paper trail that will hold up in court. If you want to talk about damage, let's discuss the trajectory of the video from Bellanotte." He opened another folder and slid over printouts of social media posts, news headlines, and customer reviews that had gone viral in the past week. Evelyn's attorney shifted in his seat, scanning the pages. He knew exactly what this kind of exposure could do if it reached a courtroom, especially if the press decided to follow it. The younger man cleared his throat and suggested we take a short break. Evelyn didn't respond. Her eyes still locked on me, like we were in our own private battle. In the hallway, Thomas leaned against the wall, lowering his voice. "They came in here thinking they could bluff. They're rattled now. Hold your line." When we reconvened, Evelyn's attorney's tone had changed. He said they would need to review the materials thoroughly and consider the full implications before making another proposal. He asked for a few days to respond. Thomas agreed, noting that if we didn't hear back within the week, we would proceed with filing the lawsuit. Evelyn rose first, gathering her purse and papers. As she passed me, she paused just long enough to say quietly, "You're enjoying this too much." I didn't answer. The door closed behind them, and the room felt lighter. Sophie exhaled audibly from her corner. Thomas began collecting the documents into neat stacks, a faint smile touching the edge of his mouth. "They're going to think about it," he said, "which means they're already calculating the cost of losing." I left the office with the sense that the balance had shifted again. The numbers were still on paper, but the weight of them was now in her hands as much as mine. The meeting took place on a cold January afternoon, the kind of day where the sky hung low and gray over downtown Seattle. Thomas's conference room felt warmer than usual, the soft hum of the heating system filling the pauses between small talk. Evelyn sat across from me again, but this time without the tight smile or the performative elegance. She wore a simple black coat, her hair pulled back, and she kept her hands folded neatly on the table. Her attorney began by sliding a stack of papers toward Thomas. "This is the finalized agreement. Evelyn has agreed to repay the full $15,000, plus the $2,000 in interest and legal fees within 30 days. Additionally, the prior version of her will naming Madeline as a beneficiary to the Harper House will be reinstated effective immediately." Thomas read through the pages, his pen moving to initial each section as he confirmed the terms were exactly as negotiated. I kept my gaze steady on Evelyn, though she avoided mine, looking instead at a framed print on the wall, as if it held something she needed. When the time came to sign, she picked up the pen without hesitation. Her signature was quick, almost practiced, as if she wanted the moment over before it had fully begun. She passed the papers back to Thomas, who signed as witness. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper felt like the quietest victory I'd ever heard. Her attorney confirmed that the first payment would be wired within the week, with the remainder scheduled for transfer before the 30-day deadline. Thomas nodded, satisfied. Evelyn gathered her purse, paused for a moment, then said in a low voice, "Meant only for me. You got what you wanted." I didn't respond. A week later, I logged into my account and saw the first transfer, a clean, precise sum that looked almost unreal on the screen. By the time the second payment arrived 3 weeks later, I felt the weight I had been carrying for months begin to loosen. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the line I had drawn and the fact that it had held. Grace invited me over for dinner that night. Her house smelled like rosemary and roasted chicken, the kind of comfort I hadn't realized I'd been missing. After dessert, she walked me to the front door, her hand resting lightly on my arm. "You didn't just stand up for yourself," she said. "You stood up for everyone she's ever thought she could treat this way." The words sank in deeper than I expected. For so long, my choices had felt like a reaction to whatever Evelyn decided. Now, for the first time, I had chosen my ground and stayed there. Outside, the air was crisp, the kind that made your breath visible in the porch light. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into the night, the cold settling around me in a way that felt almost clean.